Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Josie Badger, and I am the project director of RAISE under SPAN Parent Advocacy Network. We are so excited to have you here today for this session on Accessibility 101 from the American Foundation for the Blind. This information has been helpful to us. We've used AFB to help create some materials and work on our websites. And we realized how important their information and knowledge would be to all of you. So we are so glad that you are joining us today. Next slide. Miriam, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Josie. Okay, so you can use closed captioning here to start using it. Click the caption button over there as it's shown on the slide. And we also have interpretation to Spanish. Van a ver en la banda o cinta negra un globo que indica interpretación. Hagan clic allí. Luego seleccionan español y opriman donde dice Mute Original Audio. Esto último filtra completamente la presentación en inglés para que puedan escuchar con claridad a Raquel, nuestra intérprete para. And for using American Sign Language, we will pin the interpreter. So, and you can also hover over the video of the participant you want to pin and click. Okay. And you will see 3 little dots over the person you would like to pin. And you can click pin. Next slide.
Thank you. The purpose of this webinar is to propose an overview of why accessibility is important and how you can integrate accessibility into all aspects of building and maintaining your website. And for many of us, many parent centers, we are actively developing websites as we speak. And so I think that this is hopefully good timing for all of you to be learning and integrating these pieces of advice while you build this page. Go ahead. So I'm going to now turn it over to our wonderful speakers to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Darren Burton, and I really appreciate you coming to this presentation today and for your interest in accessibility. I hope we have a lot of fun today, and at the end we'll have some questions for you. I've been an accessibility specialist for about half my life now, about 25 years. I got into the business. I'll tell you a story about that. I got into the accessibility biz about 25 years ago, just after I lost my sight. I lost my sight about 28 years ago, and at the time I was in the finance biz. I was fully sighted, and stocks and bonds, investment banking, and all that. And over Christmas one year, I think it was 1992, I went skiing, and I'm zipping down the slope, and whoosh, a tree jumped out and went right in front of me. And I'm really thinking, wow, what in the world happened there? What happened? Why did that tree jump out in front of me? And when I got to the bottom of the slopes, I realized that I took and caught my breath, and my peripheral vision wasn't out to the side where it should be. It was angled in about 30%. So I went to see my doc when I got home the next day, and he did some tests, and we realized there was a tumor that was affecting my optic nerve. And I had surgery to get at that tumor, and as a result of the surgery, I lost my sight completely. So again, I was 28 years old, I had a lot to learn about living with blindness. And in my work in the finance biz, none of the tools I was using to do trades for my customers, to do research, were accessible. I couldn't use any of the computer tools. Here's a good example, the Wall Street Journal, something I read every day, I could still get in Braille, but it came a week late, and it was a stack about this big. Not searchable, would take me forever to read. So a big stack of paper really wasn't that useful to me. It was more like kindling. So I really reset my life and decided I would go back into, I'd actually studied electrical engineering and computer science in college, but I'd left to try to be a billionaire, right? That didn't work out so well. But that losing my sight and realizing the state of technology for people who are blind was such in really not in very good shape. Things have improved a lot. We'll be talking about some of that later. But that's kind of how I got into this biz. And like I said, I've been doing it for 25 years. I was 12 years at AFB. I was director of technology for AFB. I worked at Yahoo for 5 years after that, and I've worked with pretty much every big Silicon Valley company in the world and many, many other companies and lots of different aspects of digital inclusion, digital accessibility.
So, hi, my name is William Russell, and I am now the Director of Client Services for AFB Consulting. So thanks, Darren, for your job. I actually have been doing this for about 10 years now, and I started actually as an intern with AFB as an undergrad position. I didn't have any connection to accessibility or blindness or vision loss in general, but I was given the opportunity to join as an intern and actually interviewed with Darren. And when I went in for the interview, he had asked for a writing sample, and so I gave him something. And when I came in and sat down with him, he said, "Hey, you spelled something wrong in the writing sample. Otherwise, it was fine." I was like, I ran the spell checker. I don't know about that. And also, how did you read my paper? So Darren being a screen reader user, and I had no idea about that. So it turns out I had actually spelled something not wrong. I had used like a neighbor word that was spelled correctly, but wasn't the right word to use. But he caught that with his screen reader, and that fascinated me how he did that. And so I have been working with companies for these last 10 years, helping them establish sustainable accessibility practices. So looking forward to sharing with this group here.
Nice. And how about that when trying to pull something over on a blind guy like that? How do I even give him that job?
Yeah.
I think I did well.
All right. So a little bit about AFB. AFB's mission is to create a world of no limits for people who are blind or visually impaired, and we mobilize leaders, advance understanding, and champion impactful policies and practices using research and data. And part of our mission has been to establish this consulting practice to help companies directly to remove barriers for inclusion within the products they're creating. And so we're coming to you as AFB Consulting, but also as AFB, and as a fellow nonprofit, we understand a lot of the intricacies that go along with being a nonprofit. And so what we're trying to do is we've got 2 sessions. The first one is going to be more of an overview introductory session. We'll get some specifics towards the end, but we want to kind of level set about what accessibility is and how we actually prefer the term digital inclusion. We're going to kind of explore the landscape, talk about some legal stuff, and keep it really lightweight because you don't really need to know a lot about that. But a lot of times when you talk about accessibility, if you know anything about accessibility, you start throwing words around like the ADA or WCAG or things like that. And so we'll demystify some of those terms. And then we will start getting practical about how we can actually get started building an accessible website specifically. We talked to Josie and some of your team, kind of understanding what you all tend to do as far as technology stacks, and we heard a lot about WordPress, and so we'll dive into that a little bit more. And then session 2, which is next week, we will get deep into the weeds with some testing and some of the other more technical aspects of accessibility to try to make it as practical as possible. So let's start off with just what is inclusion. It's a buzzword that we hear a lot of, and we've got an adapted definition from globaldiversitypractice.com. It says inclusion is an organizational effort and practices in which different groups or individuals have different backgrounds, are culturally and socially accepted, welcomed, and treated and equally treated. And inclusion is a sense of belonging. Inclusive cultures make people feel respected and valued for who they are as an individual or group, and it helps individuals and teams achieve their maximum potential. Because the opposite of inclusion is exclusion, obviously. So we like to think about talent and resources and contributions people can make, and making sure that everyone is able to achieve that potential to contribute however they are to society. So inclusion is a very broad term. It's very popular right now, but we have an expansion to that called digital inclusion, which Darren, I think you've got some opinions on this.
Yeah. Thank you, William, and good definition of inclusion. Now we talk about digital inclusion, right? Can I use today's technology? And the idea of inclusion, sadly, that historically people with disabilities have often been left out of the discussion of inclusion. It's getting better now, but I know when I was in corporate America and I went to our Office of Inclusion and Diversity, I usually scared the heck out of them. Oh my gosh, it's a blind guy. What are we going to do? So it's often been a secondary thought. Matter of fact, recently I just read the NASDAQ, the stock market for the high tech stocks. They just released their inclusion statement, and it did not include anything about people with disabilities. So we are often left out. And honestly, people don't want to exclude people with disabilities. They really just don't know how to include us. And this idea of digital inclusion is how we remedy that. If you build accessible apps and websites that I can use, I can take part and be with everybody. Honestly, when I lost my sight, I was excluded from a lot of things, like fantasy baseball, right? That was a paper-based thing, and then it went to digital, which wasn't accessible. Then later at Yahoo, I got to build accessible fantasy, and I play fantasy with my buddies all the time now. So, it's just like everybody knows, being included is a big part of being a human, right? It's things about, can I send a text or look at the video my friend told me about? Can I take part in that conversation about the latest news at the water cooler at work? Again, can I even work? Can I work? Can I play? Can I take part in social media? So that's what we call digital inclusion. Can we make it real, not just a corporate checkbox like it often is, but really making things so we can really take part and be included in all of that.
Excellent. And Darren, we're probably gonna have to pick up the pace a little bit. So you can just start rolling if you want. So
okay,
let's talk about the end-to-end digital experience.
Yeah, and very good. Interestingly, I'm experiencing a usability issue right now. If you notice, I've got an earbud in my ear. So I've got a cheat sheet with a screen reader that reads the information. And I'm getting in my ear, which is accessible, everybody that's going in and out of the meeting. But it's affecting my ability to cheat. So it's interesting how sometimes there's a little gray area, and that's where we can help with people with things. So I'm going to get back to my cheat sheet, and here we go. Okay. All right. Like what we were saying, the end-to-end experience for people with disabilities is very different for everybody. Disabilities are not all the same. They're very different. Again, we're just wanting to get the idea to you to understand what the different disabilities are and how we deal with digital inclusion. And we've got some examples for each. The first one we talk about are people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And there we often think about captioning, right? If there's videos, if they're captioned, and as this one is, or there's a transcript, then they can take part, right? Okay, another one is cognitive disabilities. Fairly new science. Good user design is good user design. So people with cognitive disabilities, you want to use a good UX design, easy to use, not a lot of clutter. Think of a person with a cognitive disability or dyslexia looking with a bunch of mishkata all over the screen. How do you see that? So less clutter, that's a good way to serve that person. Also, if you think of a person with dyslexia, they can benefit from the speech output just as I do. Imagine they can see it and hear it at the same time, and that helps with the cognitive abilities there. Okay, low vision. All right, now low vision and blindness are very different, very different things. There you think of zoom, magnification, ability to make things bigger, or if a person has tunnel vision, they may want to make it smaller. But the ability to adjust the text is important. So those are tools like called screen magnifiers that people use. There's built into your computers now and your phones, you can buy third party for that. Again, there you think of contrast, right? Make sure you use good contrast. That's the #1 indicator of viewability. Often we'll see a light gray button on a dark gray background. Not so good. You want to really use contrasting colors there. Color blindness is part of this. 8% of men are red-green colorblind. So be careful using red and green. For Yahoo Finance, we use a lot of red and green. We had to fix that. Again, don't worry about not using color. I don't want to dumb things down. I want things to be very visual, but don't use color alone, right? Don't use just
Yeah.
a red color to it. Yeah.
And so yes, so what we've got are some line charts here visually that we can see. Yeah. So a bad example of some line charts are if you've got 4 different series on a line chart and you've just got different colors. If you think about maybe you're not even colorblind, maybe you just printed this out, for example, in black and white. And below you can see if you remove the saturation, remove the colors, those lines are basically indistinguishable. So, you know, a tip would be to, instead of having just color, to add some symbols into the series, or add some texture to the line chart. And the point is, for color blindness, you can't rely on color to convey information. Color is awesome and can reinforce information, but there has to be some sort of alternative, some texture, some sort of distinguishing element or additional labeling for color. So that's one that we like to bring up because so often things get printed out or we neglect the usage of color, and that can really be a barrier for 8% of men, and 1 in 20 women have color blindness. So it's something that really we need to be considering.
I didn't know that 1 in 20 number. Very good. Yeah, thanks, William. Okay, then one more category is blindness, and that's like me. I use a screen reader, so I use a keyboard to input and to navigate through a website. I also might use a braille display, which is very interesting, which is invaluable to a person who is both deafblind. With that, it's basically a bar of braille dots that come up and down, depending on what I've focused on, to allow me to read it with my finger. So imagine if I'm deaf and blind, that's the only way I can get digital information. And a screen reader is extremely powerful. I can arrow through things, but I can also navigate through a website by heading, by line, by paragraph, by image, by form field. As long as the person designs it right, I can do that. One of my pet peeves is people often will use to indicate a heading on a page, they'll make it big and bold, so it visually looks like a heading. If they don't code the proper HTML code to tell me or tell anyone that it's a heading, I lose that ability. And those headings give me not only the ability to navigate quickly, but to get a feel for the structure, to visualize how the page looks. That's what a lot of blind people use. And William, I believe you've got a video for this, right?
Yeah, we do. And, you know, we're going to revisit some of those concepts that Darren just mentioned. But you know, realize this is a lot of dense information. You don't have to be an expert in all of this. The point is, people use assistive technology to access a page, and we don't necessarily know how somebody is going to come and access our page. So we need to be as well behaved as possible, use the best designs that we can to be as inclusive as possible. And so that's really the point of what we're getting towards. But for a screen reader, we keep mentioning the screen reader use case. And that is because a screen reader user is also a keyboard user, which is very similar to the way switches work. They also require you know, the screen reading, where you have to have all of your labels and everything properly structured. And they cover most of the use cases that the other pieces of assistive technology also use. So we focus on the screen reader use case because if you make it work for a screen reader, usually it's going to cover those other cases as well. So what's a screen reader? I've got a demo. If you've never heard a screen reader speaking, I hear Darren's chattering in the background, and he listens to it at like a million words per minute. But I've got a demo that'll slow it down and give you an idea of really what we're talking about, how an alternative method of accessing a website actually works, and a good version of that where the website's working correctly, and a bad version where it's not working correctly. So I'll go ahead and click play. So here's a quick demo of what it actually sounds like to use a screen reader. And here I'm on a web page that was specifically designed to showcase some good and bad aspects of a website. And so we'll start on the good page. And this is what we're expecting when we are using a screen reader on a page. I'll just be using the up and down arrow keys and the tab key to move around the interface.
Link news. Link tickets. Clickable survey. Out of list heading level 1 city lights survey.
So the screen reader is speaking what we would expect it to. It tells us that we have the home button, the news button, and then when we get to the City Lights survey, it provides us with a little bit extra information. It tells us that that's a heading level 2. So let's keep going through the interface.
Heading level 2 this week's survey, more city parks a pain or a gain. Fields are required if not otherwise noted. Grouping favorite park. Which is your favorite city park? Radio button not checked, none.
So when we move to a radio button, it tells us radio button not checked, none. So it gives us all the information we would need to use this control.
Radio button not checked, Central Park. Radio button not checked, Grand Park.
And that is basically how a screen reader works. We're going to just navigate using a keyboard on a page, and the screen reader is going to tell us what it's seeing on the page. So let's move over to a bad version of this, just so you can see what somebody might be experiencing if a page is not designed well and it's not working as they expect. Okay, so now I'm back to the original place that I started, and I'm just going to arrow down and see how the screen reader behaves differently.
Blank. Link unlabeled graphic NAV news. Blank. Link unlabeled graphic NAV facts. Blank. Link unlabeled graphic NAV survey.
So it's telling me that there's unlabeled graphics, and it's kind of confusing. There's elements that just say blank, and it's a lot more difficult to use.
Blank. Blank. City Lights survey. This week's survey, more city parks a pain or a gain.
You'll also notice it doesn't tell us that this is a heading, which is really valuable information for a screen reader user. But maybe the worst part of it is when we get down into these radio buttons, you'll see what it does.
Blank. Table with 3 rows and 4 columns, row 1 column 1 through. Which is your favorite city park? Column 4. Row 3 column 1, radio button not checked. Blank. Radio button not checked. Blank. Radio button not checked.
So it doesn't tell me anything about the radio buttons at all, just that they're there. And so this would be an unlabeled button. So if someone tells you with their screen reader that they're getting unlabeled elements, or there's blanks, or there's no alt text, this is really what they're experiencing. There's no way, if you can't see the screen, to determine what some of these elements are. So when someone tells you that this is what they're experiencing, now you can kind of understand where they're coming from and understand how difficult it could be to use a website or an app that isn't built to be accessible.
All right, so hopefully that brings a little bit of context about what we're talking about. I think that another thing we can think about as far as poor accessibility, that's the screen reader use case that we went through, but we talked about some other things. So if you think about trying to read like a low contrast content on your phone out in the daylight, like you're trying to read a news article and there's text that's too faint, that's an accessibility issue, even though you might not consider yourself to have low vision, or maybe you have 20/20 vision. You can also think about mistakenly touching the wrong button because a button's too small or buttons are too close together on your phone. Or if you ever submit a form and the error message comes back with nonsense, or it doesn't explain itself very well, or you're hunting to try to find where the problem is when you're trying to fill out a form, that can be extremely difficult to deal with. And one way that you could reverse this is to say, obviously, good accessibility benefits everyone. So these are just some really basic bad examples. But if we think about having really good contrast that looks great when you're sitting at your desk, but also looks great when you're out in the environment, or you're not in an ideal environment sitting at your office or something like that, because people use technology differently than what you're expecting. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the terms, some of the landscape. Maybe you've got some experience with accessibility, and maybe you've heard some of these terms. So legal landscape, very awesome, very fun topic to discuss. So laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, is something that somebody that gets mentioned a lot. So we have a lot of clients that say, hey, our website needs to be ADA accessible or ADA compliant, which actually is kind of meaningless in itself, because the ADA says, yes, places of public accommodation need to be accessible, but it doesn't specify anything about how to do it. Another one is Section 508, which is a federal procurement law, which isn't relevant to a lot of people, whereas the ADA is. Section 508 isn't necessarily, but at least Section 508 does have some specifics in it. And then there's another one called the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, which is like TVs, phones, anything that transmits video content is required to be accessible. So these are some of the laws. There are more. And there are, of course, state laws that mandate accessibility. But most laws don't actually specify exactly what accessibility means. Most of them are referring to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. And WCAG is not a law, but it makes more sense to say something is WCAG compliant, because WCAG is a set of guidelines that does help ensure, doesn't guarantee accessibility, but helps ensure that your website is more inclusive if you adhere to the WCAG guidelines. We're not going to go into great detail about WCAG, but these are some of the buzzwords that probably get thrown around. You may have heard about them, and it's usually good to just mention it, that really most of these laws are just going to be references to WCAG. If you really want to understand what makes the web accessible or how to make your website accessible, learning about WCAG is the way to do that. But we're going to stay practical in this. There are some that would be very, would stand on principle and say that everything has to be 100% WCAG compliant before you have any level of success at all. And we don't have that. We understand that sentiment, but we think a lot of effort is wasted. And so really we're talking about the difference between accessibility and usability. And Darren, let's talk about that.
Yeah, yeah, certainly all this stuff about legal compliance is very important. Obviously, nobody wants to get in legal trouble, but we often kind of equate accessibility and legal compliance together as kind of a low bar, right? We really want to focus on genuine usability, which is a much higher bar. One of my colleagues at Yahoo had a great quote. He said, if compliance is your goal, if you're any worse at all, you're illegal. That's not where we want to be. We want to be at a much, much better place, much better user-friendly place. So I guess the basics of accessibility and compliance is, can I do it and we won't get sued? Okay, let's check that off, fine. But usability adds the actual, well, the actual experience. Can I get it done? Do I enjoy it? Can I get it done as fast as my colleagues can get it done, right? True usability, that's when the task is enjoyable and I don't hate you at the end of it. You know, a couple decades ago, I just wanted to get on the field no matter how slanted it was. Now, I want to get on that level playing field so I can compete with my colleagues, right? On an equal footing. With simple compliance, I may get the job done, but I may lose my job because I do it much slower than my sighted counterparts. When I get that even playing field, sometimes I can even do it faster than my sighted counterparts, and maybe move up the ladder a little bit there. So that's what we're talking about, that general user experience that allows me to do it in a positive way, not hacking my way through. So that, hopefully that made some sense, and we are going to be taking questions later if we don't. A couple of the things that we talk about when we talk about being compliant or being accessible, some of the tools you can use. There are automated scanner tools out there. What are some of the names of them? Like what, Axe, what else?
Yeah, well, there are lots of them, and
yeah, there's a lot. Yeah,
we can talk about that. I think we're focusing on automated scanning being a potential pitfall, right?
Right. They're very useful. We use them. They can catch. They're somewhat artificial intelligence tools that go in and scan a site and give you a report on how accessible it is. It can be a decent place to start, but a horrible place to finish. It catches maybe 20, maybe 25% of your issues. So you're still going to have to go in and do a lot of manual work anyway. So these tools can be useful, but they're not by any means a magic button. Another magic button a lot of people see these days, which is not really a magic button, are what we call overlays. This is software that a company might want to sell to you. There's a company, I think Accessibility's one, AudioEye, there's several. And it's an automatic button. They claim one line of code makes your site accessible. We wish that was true. We really, William and I want to be obsolete. We want to not have to do this. We wish there was a magic button, but there's not. Those tools can also even make a site even worse. They're really not a good answer. And they use the automatic scanners to find issues to fix. So if those scanners are only catching 20, 25%, these overlays couldn't possibly make a site completely accessible. So again, our site, our philosophy and approach to accessibility is to really focus on that usability and not really, and do the due diligence and not rely on the magic button so much.
Yeah, thinking about the authentic user experience, and a key here is achievable user success, right? So I mentioned that, WCAG is something we're not even going to talk about, because for a lot of organizations, focusing on the web content accessibility guides, 100% conformance to that, is probably going to use up all, if not more, of your available resources. Wherein thinking about what achievable user success looks like, what do you want people to be able to do? That is what we want to be able to, that's what we want to be focusing on. So we've got a little bit more on that in a second, but I wanted to reemphasize that what we're really thinking about here.
Good. And I want to talk a little bit now about the business case for accessibility, right? Not only is it the right thing to do and there's legal issues, but people with disabilities are a critical market, both as consumers and employees. There's over 1 billion people with disabilities across the world. That's a huge market no one wants to miss. I believe it's 1 in 4 people in the United States have a disability. People with disabilities have $500 billion in disposable income. I'm still looking for mine. I'm not sure where my part of that $500 billion is, but I've got it somewhere. But again, we're also very loyal employees. The numbers, I'm not sure what the numbers, somewhere between 50 and 70% people with disabilities are unemployed. So when we do get a job, we like to keep that job. So we're very loyal employees. And with this assistive technology we talked about, we can be very effective employees too. And as I mentioned too, it's not just for your customers, it's for your employees, right? We need to make sure their tools are usable and accessible also. Okay, and I'm flipping around on my cheat sheets.
Yep. That's excellent, Darren. I will finally take us into some practicality.
Okay.
So how do we get started? What do we start with our accessibility journey? Spoiler alert, we're not going to have all of the answers for you, but we can definitely get you started. The key word is journey. It is not something that you start one day and finish the next. It is something that you start, and the goal is continuous improvement until you have a sustainable practice with accessibility. It becomes part of your culture. And that is starting with making an accessibility policy. So make an accessibility policy that helps embed accessibility into product goals and day-to-day operations at the outset. So this organization has different goals than maybe a company who is developing a product has, but you definitely have constituents. You have people that are using your products and services that need to be able to rely on it to be accessible and inclusive. And it starts with just saying, okay, we're going to make sure that moving forward, we're thinking about accessibility. It's integrated into our policy. We have to be thinking about what we're doing with everything that we're doing and considering accessibility. And this helps, especially if it's from the top down in an organization. It helps enable individuals to have the resources and leverage that they need to achieve your goals. So we're talking about things like budgeting. If you're going to be launching a new website, we need to be considering ensuring that we have the budget available to have somebody check it to make sure it's going to be accessible, or attending trainings, doing things like we're doing right now to really ensure that the people working on your website understand accessibility and what the responsibility is with regards to accessibility moving forward.
Yeah.
So starts at the very beginning with a policy and I would say a consistent voice and a consistent vocabulary.
William, a couple points you made there, I just want to add on to the budget. If we embed it in the whole process, it's a lot less expensive than at the end going, oh no, we forgot about accessibility. Let's go back and reformat everything. That's going to be a lot more expensive. So keeping that budget in mind. Also, when you integrate this authentic user testing throughout the process, you avoid that issue of, boy, I made me get the job done, but I hate you. You know, getting that, making it a positive experience, an enjoyable experience. You can keep that on track if you embedded it throughout the process.
Yep. Awesome. So about that authentic user testing, what do we mean by authentic user testing? Tell me about key workflows and testing and those goals and making sure that goals are met rather than some, you know, general ethereal policy about WCAG compliance.
Yeah, in that area, one of those things you want to look at is to target at workflows. If you've got a site or an app or something, what are the 5 or 10 or whatever the number is? What are the important things you want your people to do, right? One of them often is just that registration, that sign up process. You wouldn't imagine how many times we come across that. And that's such a blocker. That's a critical blocker at the beginning, and you'll never get anybody there. And Wayne, why don't you tell them about the report cards that you developed?
Yeah, so one way to do this is if we know that we have a registration process, for example, or some sort of form to fill out, we can set up a report card. Again, understanding we know budgets are limited. We know time is limited. So what is critical? And let's track and make sure that the critical processes don't regress. And so we can set up a report card system where, you know, we have some test procedures that we go through to ensure that certain browsers and maybe screen reader combinations work in a way that we know is consistent. We're going to track that over time. We're going to do testing as we're deploying changes, as we're developing new things. Let's fill out that report card and make sure that we haven't regressed in areas that we shouldn't have. And, you know, for really complex sites, big sites with a lot of content on them, or more like functionality, taking samples of what needs to be done, as opposed to, you know, for example, I had a corporate client that was quite misguided in the way that they were tackling accessibility. And so what they did was they had an automated scanner, and the automated scanner is not necessarily the bad guy here, but they ran the scanner on their very large site, and it came back with something like 400,000 accessibility issues, which is about the same as 0 accessibility issues, because you just pick one out of a hat and change it and hope that that impact's perfect and wonderful, but that's not realistic. It isn't, and can be a barrier to real innovation. And so we really encourage people to focus on key workflows and tracking that over time, and integrate in, you know, WCAG later, because it's journey. So we start out with the critical pieces and then move towards, you know, more comprehensive compliance.
Good point. Yeah. And as we're doing all this, we're trying to build this culture of inclusion in your organization, right? And there's lots of different roles that people can play to do that. And we're going to talk about some of those roles. Now, just to sort of reset the point, a small nonprofit may not have all these roles, but being aware of those roles, so you can communicate with maybe a third party that's doing it, just to be aware of some of this. So we're going to go through and talk about how your organization can, again, achieve that digital inclusion. So what would one be? Designers, right? The designer, again, have to have the vision of what it's going to be, but that designer also has to be considered about accessibility. Like we talked about earlier, the use of color, right? Again, that designer, she might think, I want to build this really neat new widget in there, but wait, step back. Can a screen reader user use that? Can a switch user access that? So the designer has to be cognizant of this. Also developers, right? That's the coder, that's the engineer who goes in and builds. He has to know the actual HTML code, or whichever code if he's building apps, different code, that he has to know the where the rubber hits the road. Things like how to do an alt tag, right? If you have an image, I might just hear image.gif.gred. Whatever. An alt tag goes in there and tells me image of the American flag or company logo, something like that. So again, that's where the developer needs to know. Another one is procurement, right? You will probably be using some third-party vendors either to design or develop, or maybe just buy a part of their ad or a piece of software. You always want to talk to those vendors and ask them about accessibility. What's your experience with it? Let them tell you how accessible their product is. If they don't seem aware or start talking really fast, you might want to go to a different company. What else, William? If I missed some roles there, marketing.
So we've got
what else?
customer service, we got communications, we got marketing, you know, and in our organization, AFB, this is all of these roles are probably one person, maybe one person plus some consultants. So we totally understand that that smaller organizations don't have all of these, but somebody is making decisions in all of these roles. So, you know, customer service, if you are doing customer service, and communications and marketing, things that go out, those are often neglected areas of emphasis that are really important as well. So, you know, as we started, this is a culture of inclusion. It's a culture of accessibility, and everyone can understand where they fit in to this.
Yeah. Just sort of to pile on that, well, I had some stories about when I was at Yahoo to try to create that culture of accessibility, because when I came, they had about a year earlier, they had dropped their accessibility team right about when a lot of these laws came into effect. So I had to come in and really change that culture to get them to think about it, talk to all the different people on those teams. Some of the things I did, a lot of it was, you know, I was a techie, right? But I was probably more of an evangelist than I was a techie. I had to change some minds. So walking around campus with my cane, having people see me was a first step. Showing them my abilities as a computer user was big. One of the things I really did a lot was we had a lot of the different teams would have these stand-up meetings. And I'd find out the time and date, and I'd just go and I'd stand right up with them. I'd barge right in. Hey, everybody, how you doing? What do you know about accessibility? I'm Darren. I'm here to help. And I maybe get into the whole conversation of that whole meeting and almost dominate it. And, you know, that worked to an extent. And often after that, after I made my presence felt, often I would just show up and stand in the background. They would see me, oh, there's Darren, I got to remember this. So a lot of this is, again, evangelism. But it's funny, we had this beautiful cafeteria at Yahoo with tons of food. And at lunch, I would go and stand at a wall for about a half hour before I'd get my lunch, and people would just come up and ask questions. And I would be an question and answer session. My boss would joke, remember the Peanuts cartoon where Lucy, the character Lucy Van Pelt, she had her little psychology stand, psychology help 5 cents. We were going to put an accessibility help 5 cents, and we put it behind a booth right there. But that really, really worked. Again,
hey,
just, yeah.
So one thing about that come ask anything session, we get to do that here. We actually have 2 of those scheduled. We'll talk about more of that later, where we actually have a couple of sessions that you can come to. We'll have some experts there. Bring your questions, bring things you're working on about accessibility, and we can talk directly to what's going on as a resource that you have available to you. And we'll have more information on that later. But you know, just getting started, having those questions, figuring this out is really critical. So, Darren, we're making pretty good time. So let's keep rolling. So, how can we start implementing accessibility into our website? It's a good question. So obviously, we want to start at the beginning. We want to start at the design phase. We mentioned that. So if you are designing a new website, about to launch one, you know, we've had the benefit of working with a lot of organizations at this stage. You know, we want to launch a new website. We're looking at stuff. Where do we get started? Well, if you are using a WordPress site, for example, or another kind of builder site out of the box, and this is as opposed to somebody, you know, sitting down and writing your own website from scratch, which a lot of people aren't doing. You can set yourself up for success by starting with a theme that is accessible from the start. For a big company, for a big organization that has a whole design team and all of that stuff, usually they're using a design system where they design all of these components, and then all of these components get placed on the page. And all we have to do to make that page accessible is start with those components. There's maybe 12 or 15 different components. We test them to make sure they're accessible. And then when you build a page out of those components, you're like 80 or 90% of the way there. So same principle here. This does potentially limit a little bit of your options, but if you are choosing a theme to build from, you can start with one that's accessible. And WordPress, for example, has a filter called Accessibility Ready. And unfortunately, you kind of have to take their word for it. There isn't like, as far as I know, they're not specifically vetted or specifically tested. But if you do take that, do your due diligence to look at a base theme and see if it's accessible, you can really get started.
Yeah, that's a good point, When looking at those themes, you can tell pretty easily if they have high contrast or not. And that's one good, easy way to pick a theme. Well, because begin your process of picking a theme is to look and see how, if there is contrast, if you see that gray on gray or that light yellow on slightly orange, it doesn't work very well. So those are some good ways to get started with picking.
And luckily, if you are going to take a theme and do a lot of customizations to it, maybe you could tweak those colors and make those changes and things like that to make it work better. But things like the menus and all of the different aspects of the theme itself, starting with a really solid foundation is great. And one thing that you can do is, if you are going to secure resources for a third party to come and help, an expert to help, have them take a look at some themes, pick 2 or 3 of them, and then just ask, pull in an expert that can take a look at those themes and give you a thumbs up or thumbs down on them, and let you know where you're probably going to be starting on a good place, or there are some accessibility problems with this theme that you probably are going to want to avoid. And so that's one way to efficiently use your resources to ensure that you're starting with a really solid initial based theme. So I know that WordPress for sure has an accessibility ready tag. If you're using Drupal, there are some themes like that. And most of the marketplaces, not all of them, a lot of the marketplaces do have accessibility as either a filter or a keyword you can search for to find some options.
Wayne, what was that other tool you mentioned other than WordPress? Was it Drupal?
Drupal.
Okay, good. That's another good tool to start. You can start with. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just a new content management. Actually, AFB uses a Drupal. We're happy with the admin site, but I know a lot of the folks in this organization, in this network, is using WordPress as well, which there's some great options. So, all right. So we've picked a good template. Now we have to be aware of third-party plugins. This is the next place where people go wrong immediately. So there are some dangerous components. Now, one thing that we like to say is that accessibility doesn't limit your design options. It really doesn't. It's going to guide you to certain decisions, but it's not preventing you from doing anything. But if you're not building it yourself and you're not responsible for the accessibility, you can't go in and make a lot of detailed code changes to a menu, then you are going to be limited, because you're responsible. As soon as you put something on your site, you're responsible for its accessibility. So a lot of menus, especially mega menus, for example, can be really inaccessible and difficult, because if you think about the desktop version versus the mobile version and how it has to be responsive and the way that interacts with the screen reader, menus we find to be really problematic in a lot of ways. And there are some that work pretty well. But that's one that you really need to take a good look at to make sure that it works before you get started. Carousels are those, those Darren's favorite thing. Those are little slideshow things that rotate between images and stuff. Those marketing folks really like them, but a lot of studies show that they aren't super effective. But they can be
not accessible.
Yeah, exactly. They can be very inaccessible. There are good carousels. Carousels can be used well, but it's one of those third-party plugins that we would say, be really careful. Do your due diligence on this before you implement it on your site, because otherwise you're going to start doubling down on accessibility problems. And then light boxes or modal dialogues, the things that pop up and blank out the background and direct your focus to a specific area. Those can be also just general modal dialogues. Those can be very problematic for a lot of different reasons if they're not done properly. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of these. You can have an accessible carousel, you can have an accessible lightbox. It does probably exactly what you want, but you got to pick the right one. And that's hard to do. So it requires a lot of very good due diligence. And this is another area. If you're going to bring in external resources, have them focus here next.
Can I ask you a clarifying question, William?
You may, Matthew. Hello.
Thank you. Hi there. I just, because I get asked this all the time, and I know that you and Darren do as well, so I'm expecting that someone here might have heard it, which is someone, our hypothetical person, they've learned a little about accessibility. They want to do the right thing. They're committed to doing it. However, they've been led to believe that to make their website 100% accessible and inclusive means that they have to accept some degree of compromise in the visual design, that it can't be beautiful or innovative. Did I hear you say a minute ago that that is not the case?
That is not the case. And we are very confident that accessible designs can be beautiful and can be interesting.
Right.
But if you are going to do something new and unique and develop something new, then you take all of the responsibility in making that work. So we don't think that accessibility is a limitation. We think that an accessible site is going to be more beneficial for everyone. But if you are going to do something, it doesn't have to be boring. Like your site can have color, your site can have a good visual design, but
it can have videos.
Yes, it can have all of that stuff, but it has to be done thoughtfully. Thanks, Matthew. I believe we're going to have a little bit of more Matthew on the next session we have next week. So thanks for speaking up. All right, so speed round here. Picking great colors and fonts. So Darren talked about this. So you have a lot of flexibility in the colors and fonts that you're using. There are some thresholds that you want, and so you're going to want to check the colors that you're using. You're going to make sure that you're using fonts that are large, and a lot of this is, intuitive. If you look at something and it doesn't look like it's very high contrast, you can be pretty confident that it's not. But there are a lot of different tools. We've got a link here to one that you just put in the foreground color, you put in the background color, and it's going to spit out whether or not this is passing according to the WCAG standard, which of course then is going to say this is a good color combination I can use. So this is a place that you're going to need to be thinking about. And then another one that we've talked about, and we're going to go into more detail about this next week, is headings and page structure. So Darren, I know you're passionate about headings. So headings, therefore, one, you have to use actual headings, but they should be logical. And to be logical, they should be short. They should be relatively short. You don't want to have a lot of very lengthy headings because then, Darren can't quickly navigate through that if he has to listen to a 3 or 4 sentence heading.
Right.
And they should logically nest. Heading level 1 should be a title. It should describe the whole page. Heading level 2 should be the context. And then heading level 3 should be related again to the heading level 2. So, the outline format. You shouldn't skip a bunch of levels. You shouldn't randomly place things. And visually, you can style a heading to look one way, but use the correct heading level as well. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this next week, but these are some of the things that we can be thinking about as we're building sites. We're right at 1 hour here for this presentation. So we promised we'd stick around for Q&A. I want to quickly go over what we're doing next week. So we've got an accessibility toolkit. And there's a link in the presentation. I'm sure it'll be emailed out as well. What we have in there is an accessibility testing guide that we put together specifically for this group. It's going to be, how you can get started testing. And as some homework for next week, it would be great if you could do, take a look at the first and second section. The first section is about visual testing, goes into a little bit more about contrast and some of that stuff. And then it goes into keyboard testing. And it would be awesome if you could just take a look at your website and do some of that keyboard testing that we have in the testing guide and see what comes up and see if you're successful. Yeah.
And
we also
go ahead, William. Go ahead.
So we have, I'm just going to move on through here. We have a procurement checklist. So we mentioned procurement as a big deal. And it is, depending on a lot of different factors within your organization. We have a checklist for procurement because we didn't have time to really dive deep into this. But if you're thinking about everything that you're buying or procuring in one way, and even open source or free software, that's procurement as well. Some things you can go through, a checklist you can go through to make sure that you have some questions to ask a vendor and ways to kind of determine whether or not the vendor that I'm working with actually has credible claim to accessibility. And then the third thing we have in this toolkit is just a collected set of resources, which is just a bunch of links that will go into a lot more detail on a bunch of different topics, some technical testing stuff, some of the web standards, a lot of the things we didn't have time to look into. And this is, there are tons of these resources and collections out on the web, but we've curated this specifically for this group because we think that it has the most practical information in it. And we hope that these 3 resources are helpful. And when we meet next week, you can maybe have a little bit more context on what we're going to be working with. You can download these as Google Docs, or you can go ahead and download them as a Word document format as well. Google Docs will let you do that if you prefer. And we will be able to get a little bit more specific, and hopefully you can have some context before we dive into a lot more of the detailed testing next week. So try to do the homework assignment, which is some of the testing on your site. And then, as I mentioned, we will be having some dedicated sessions for Q&A where there won't be an agenda. You just bring what you're working on, and Darren and I and maybe a couple of other experts from AFB will be there to just talk one-on-one on what you're working on, and hopefully really get you started, cut through some of the confusion if there is any, and get you started on the right answer for some of the things that you're working on. And we'd love to do some live testing with you, and whatever else it makes sense. And so we'll have more information on that. I think that'll be scheduled in the next month or so, but more details will be coming for that. But I wanted to make sure that you all knew that that was in the plan. So Darren, what's going on?
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Did you have a comment?
Just when you were talking to homework, I was going to say that all of your smartphones, all of your computers, even your smart TVs do have screen readers built in. So turn them on and play around with it. It's very powerful stuff, and you might really like it. When we built the smart TV at Yahoo, we built smart TVs for a couple of the companies, and the engineers I worked with were so enamored with screen readers and how it could let their eyes rest and they could listen to the information they needed to get. They all were using it at a high speed at the end of that process. So screen readers are good for everybody. So check it out.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So we have about 25 minutes for Q&A. I see a couple of questions coming through chat, and if any of the SPAN folks want to surface the questions that come through, we'd love to address them. Otherwise, Darren and I are just going to keep rambling on about stuff, which probably might be valuable.
Yes, William, this is Johan. I can go ahead and put up the first question in the chat before we open it up to those on the call for them to unmute themselves. So one of the questions here is, large email systems such as Constant Contact and MailChimp are notorious for being problematic. Are there any programs that make more accessible mass emails?
Yeah, so so again, we're back to the template question. So if you pick a base theme for those emails that go out that is accessible, you can be successful. So we have used, Matthew, if you've got it, what is our system that we use for mass emailing? It's one of those, right? And so we've been successful. And the key is to understand what those templates are and don't put in those elements that aren't accessible, right? So a lot of times images get placed in there without alternative text. A lot of times formatting is weird because email can send out structured HTML, but sometimes it doesn't work. So I do believe all of the mass email solutions can work, but you have to be very careful about choosing and vetting before you send out a lot of the templates that do go out. And sometimes you have to make decisions that say, you know, this would be a cool thing to have, but it's not inclusive, and therefore we're going to skip out on this particular template and we're going to use this one instead.
Thank you. Another question asked also in the chat is, are there any suggestions for making your social media accessible or more accessible?
Mhm. Yeah, so we get social media questions a lot, and for the most part, social media is relatively simple. So depending on what you're sharing, you might be sharing images, and images need to have alternative text. Alternative text will go into a lot more detail next week, but basically it's just the description of what that image is. If you're posting videos and things like that, I think most people understand what the requirements for video are, which is closed captions, description for the videos if necessary, and those two things make it a lot more inclusive.
Yeah, did we cover descriptive video earlier? I can't remember. I don't know if we did.
I
But
think that one might have got cut.
yeah, but what it really is, descriptive video is very valuable. For example, when I watch a Netflix show, and I actually help show Netflix how to do this with their player and help them build that, is I hear a narrator. I've got a setting on my phone or on my television that there's a narrator that describes the action. So through the dialogue and the other sounds, I might know that the couple is embracing, but I don't know. And my narrator tells me that she's pulling out a knife and stabbing the guy. So it's really cool. It allows me, I can catch about 90% or so through dialogue and other sounds, but that descriptive video adds real information to that. So there are tools out there that allow you to add that, just like adding an alt tag to your picture, your photo, you can add descriptive video to a video. And there's ways to make it elegantly go in between the dialogue too.
And you don't have to go nuts about this.
Correct.
Either, right? So,
be minimal.
So one thing that would definitely be not accessible is if you had a video that was like a text with a landscape and some music over it. Like, so it's text with a landscape, and that's all it is, right? That was something that a little bit of audio description or alternative text would be really important for. Something where it's like an interview where somebody's just talking, and you don't need descriptive video for that, right? It's just an interview, and the content is the speech. So things that don't have spoken content a lot of times can be enhanced either through alternative text or some of that descriptive video. So it's something to think about. Yeah. All right.
Thank you again for that, William and Darren. Next question here in the chat. What is the best way for My Parent Center to collect feedback on our efforts to improve accessibility?
It's a good question, Darren. I don't know if you've got any thoughts, or Matthew, of course, you can just dive in.
Yeah, I'll throw out a couple cents, and Matthew, if you have something else. One of the things is good to have, if you do have a customer service phone number or text, to have that person trained to be able to answer those questions and forward those questions to the proper person. Other sorts of communication, feedback, chat, things like that work. What do you guys, anything else add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there are survey systems that work just fine. It depends on what you're trying to understand, and it's best to meet people where they are. So if they're going through like a registration form, for example, and you've got a little link that says, tell us how we did on this form, that's a great way to collect feedback, and you can ask accessibility questions on that. Of course, the feedback form has to be accessible, but there are a lot of solutions that are accessible in that regard. So I think you've got a lot of leeway for this. Always collecting kind of anecdotal messages from people that call in is great. And if you have a procedure for capturing that feedback, that's awesome. But then you can also just ask through a survey link.
Thank you for answering that question. Next one to follow up, just a few more in chat. After these, we unmute if anyone else wants to ask directly to the presenters. Next question is, should language on our links be as informative as possible? For example, click here to watch full name of workshop versus click here or register here for full name of workshop versus register here.
Awesome. That's a good question.
A good one. Yeah, click here has been a bane of my existence for 25 years. How many times I've seen click here? Like what? For what? Sometimes I can get it from the interstitial or local text close to that, but you want to be as informing as possible, while also being concise, if that makes sense. I think register here is fine. You don't need to say register here to blah, blah, blah. I mean, if I'm on your webinar page, I
Yep.
pretty much know what I'm registering for. What
That's
do you
exactly
think?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add that if you're on the page for a specific webinar and you've got a button at the bottom or a link at the bottom that says register here, that's really obvious because you're on the page for it. So context does matter. There are some advanced techniques you can use to add additional context to links on the page that isn't rendered visually. And that can be helpful in certain circumstances. But I think in general, avoiding the word click here is generally
Right.
good because click here doesn't tell you anything. You can visually see that something is styled as a link, or you can visually see that something is styled as a button. So removing that verbosity is good. But then putting more information in the link text is good in most cases.
Right. One other thing, one technique that some blind people use is they can put all the links in a list and use first letter navigation. So again, let's go back to the sports analogy. I'm looking at for NFL teams, and if they all say, click here for Pittsburgh, click here for Philadelphia, click here for Dallas, that doesn't do me much good. But if it'll say Dallas Cowboys, I can hit the letter D and get quickly to that one. So using the first letter of the first word for the link, having that have to do with something that person's looking for, can be helpful. It's not, that's not nothing that we would require you to do, but that's a possible thing to do.
And the biggest issue with links, and we'll leave it here because we could talk forever,
Right.
is when you have like 50 links on the page that say click here, that's really where the problem
Right.
occurs. Having one link on a page that says click here, again, you can probably figure it out from context. It's not ideal, but it's like 50 that say the same thing, and that repetitiveness and requiring someone to look up more information than just the link is when it becomes problematic.
Thank you. That question itself was a good question. I feel that
Yeah.
we're all generally guilty of that,
Oh.
that habit. The next question, we were considering the use of widgets to start with. Do you recommend them?
So what are we talking about with widgets? I think that unfortunately, I'm not sure I have enough information. And if we're talking about widgets like the accessibility overlay widgets, things that you click it and you get the tools for accessibility, like the zooming and the font changes and the color changes and those sorts of things. Again, really focusing in on what that is, that's doing, and making sure that that is not replacing an accessible site. So if the widget itself, and again, I'm assuming in context here, so if this wasn't what the question was about, I'm sorry, and we can talk during one of the workshops. If the widget itself is just providing like the font size changes and the reverse contrast changes and some of those things, those can be fine. But when they start purporting to fix or remediate your site, that's when they can be very problematic.
Correct.
Read the next question and just to know, Elena, who asked the previous question that I stated, said thank you. So it looks like you got to the point, so thank you for that. But before I read the next question, I want to follow back to the previous question about the click here, register here versus, there's a statement in response to that. I used the phrase, please use the following link to register, or the link to register will follow. How's that for a screen reader? That's a follow-up to that question.
So if that's all part of the link, that's unnecessary. That text is totally harmless, just accompanying the link, but it shouldn't be part of the link itself.
And as long as the link actually has the text, but like if you say that, please use the following link, and below I just hear link, that's not so good. When I'm focused on the link, I want to hear where that link is taking me.
Link should either be a verb if it's gonna do something. So register, and usually that's a button, or it should be a noun of what it is. So the place that it's going to take you to.
Yeah, the standings for your football team earlier.
Yep.
scores, something like that.
Thank you for that clarification. And the last question I see here in the chat, I've used the automatic accessibility checker on Adobe Acrobat for PDFs, and it often tells me that my headers are incorrect. It continues to tell me that the headers are incorrect until I change them to be part of the paragraph. It is my understanding that this is not accessible. Should I ignore the warnings from the automatic accessibility checker?
That's a tough question to answer because you really want to understand why it's failing. In general, you don't want to integrate headings into the paragraph text for the automatic accessibility checker, but also I have seen some weird behaviors. Also, the accessibility checker will have a different experience depending on where the PDF, where the content came from before it was turned into a PDF. A lot of people don't author directly in PDFs, like in Adobe Acrobat. Usually you do it in one program and then bring it over into Acrobat and edit the PDF there and tag it there. And depending on what you do, you can have different experiences. For example, if you take a Word document and properly mark up the Word document and don't put a lot of styling in it, it will pick up those headings correctly and will tag the PDF relatively well. But if you take it like from InDesign, well, InDesign can be okay. If you take it from like some of the other sources, PowerPoint sometimes is pretty dodgy, and convert that into a PDF, you're going to get some really strange behaviors like you're just describing. Yeah. And so ideally you want to figure out exactly what why it's claiming that the heading is not correct. But one surefire way you can do it is fire up a screen reader and check it and see what it does. And if the heading shows up as a heading, you're good. Doesn't matter what the checker says.
Right.
And
if
so
if the whole paragraph turns into a heading, then no, that's not good. I don't want that whole heading. I don't want to hear heading on every single line or word.
Yep.
Thank you for answering that question. So from what I see now, there are no questions in the chat, just thank yous for those that did post the question and you answered it. All participants can unmute themselves. We're at 19. But just in respect to everyone's time, as well as the presenter's time, I would say if there are one or two short questions, you can unmute yourself and put it in the chat. And if not, I will give them just about a couple of seconds. They want to unmute themselves and ask the presenters questions while we're here. If not, I do want to make a note before we close up. The evaluation for today's session has been put in the chat. The registration link for next week's session, where they'll be joining us for part 2, has been put in the chat. So please go ahead and use those links to either register or evaluate today's session. We really appreciate your feedback. In fact, we encourage you to give your feedback so we can continue bringing presentations like this and see how we can build it or what you wish to be included.
Thank you, Johan, so much. I again echo, this is Josie, that if you do have a question, please either type it or let us know. I'm going to give you a second. I'll shut up for a sec.
William, it's Matthew. The question you punted to me, I wasn't allowed to unmute, so sorry about that. I was trying to answer about the email marketing. Was every action is the one that we found to be the most accessible. You still have to be pretty deliberate, but they do seem to have the most potential for as far as like those accessible base templates for the emails. So that's every action. Every
Can
action.
one of you type that? That's
yes.
William, you're brilliant. Thank you. Every action. And that is for large mass emails.
Mass emails. And we had some success with MailChimp. That's the one I was trying to come up with as well. But we moved over to every action does more than just mass marketing. So we moved to that platform.
Okay. And I know that actually a lot of the parent centers, including, I hate to say this, but ours, we're working on making our listservs more accessible. And so That is very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
And I think, ladies and gentlemen, folks, I would encourage you to look at this toolkit. In the PowerPoint, there is a link to it. It will also be going up on our website. And the other side note, please register for next week. It's going to be fabulous. This was awesome, folks. And so please join us. Raise has a brand new website coming out, hopefully, fingers crossed, the last day of the month. So the 30th. And that will have one whole page dedicated to making things accessible. And that's both for screen readers, low vision, any hearing loss. And so we will also encourage you to check that out. We will be sending on our listserv that's hopefully accessible by then, an invitation to visit our new webpage. This has been just so eye-opening and made me so aware of the stuff that I was not. So I thank you both so much for being a part of this. And Matt, I'm excited to have you on screen next time as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks
Thanks for having us.